Now, let me introduce you to our guest tonight. Dr. Kate Coleman is the director of the campaigning group Keep Prisons Single Sex. I'd like to ask a question just to start us off. And that is just to ask, how did you come to take up this campaign to restore single-sex women's prisons?
Well, I think like so many of us, I just got really, really, really irritated, really annoyed and very angry. I've been involved in feminist campaigning for quite a number of years. And with regard to this particular issue of the single-sex rights, the sex-based rights of women generally, I'd sort of been on the sort of periphery of what was going on for probably about 5 or 6 years. I was looking, I guess, for something, a job that needed to be done, but that wasn't specifically being done. And that's absolutely not to detract from the amazing work that, Nick Williams at Fair Play for Women and others have done. What she's done has really been groundbreaking right from the start. But in terms of, and there wasn't a specific campaign for women within the criminal justice system, much less women in prison. And I started doing a little bit of research about that. There's an amazing resource called Transcrime UK. I started reading more of the accounts that the woman who runs that had posted. And that's really kind of where it began. So we started, I guess, summer 2020, and it was just, a few stickers, a couple of boxes of stickers and a Twitter account. And it was actually Lily Maynard who prompted me to start the Twitter account because I'd already got some stickers. And she said, well, I'm doing a blog post and there's stickers going up and we've got some really good photos. So I'm going to write about it. So you better have a Twitter account. You better get up and running because obviously I want to refer to you. So that was kind of where it started. And I didn't think at that time, possibly a bit naively, that the work would grow to be as fundamental and as important to me as it has, and that there would be so much that really needed to be done. I thought that not necessarily that I would have stopped it by now, because I'm not that naive, but that there wouldn't be quite so many extremely pressing issues which are facing us and which are particularly facing women in prison.
I see. And what sort of response did you get? First of all,
what, when we started out?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Yeah, good response. I mean, as I say, I'd sort of been involved in the wider issues for quite some time. So I wasn't coming to this as somebody who was completely unknown. And yes, I mean, a great deal of support, a great deal of responses. And one of the first things that I did, which actually preceded Keep Prison Single Sex, was a film called These Are Not Our Crimes, which was basically, it was drawing on the material from Transcrime UK. And it was compiling a visual presentation with, basically, sort of slides, PowerPoint presentation, but with a voiceover of the men who had been reported as female, had had their crimes recorded as female, or had been referred to as women in court. And that, I think, at the time that we started Keep Single Sex, I think it had maybe 10,000 views across various different YouTube channels where it had been posted. So there was already a lot of interest in this issue, because I think people see quite fundamentally that, yes, there's 3,400 odd women in prison. So the total number of women who could at a maximum be affected by this is very small compared to, say, women who use changing rooms or children who go to school. But when you look at the issue, it encapsulates the worst possible nightmare. You've got women who have a very, very high rate of sexual violence that they've experienced in their life, violence at the hands of men. You've got high rates of mental health problems, high rates of self-harming, a very, very vulnerable population who, of course, because they're in prison, they have no choice but to use the spaces that they're presented with at the time when they're required to use them. You know, these sort of arguments that we hear, which I consider to be completely nonsensical, that, you know, well, if you don't like a man in your toilet, if you don't like a trans woman in your toilet, then don't use that toilet. You can go and choose to use another one, even if that's acceptable. I reject that very strongly, but even if it's acceptable, it doesn't apply to women in prison. So I think women in particular, they recognise that when it comes to female offenders, if you can't get it right for women in prison, you can't get it right for anybody. Alison, you're on mute.
You're right. I'm so sorry. And it looks as though my picture's gone. There we are.
You are a black void.
Nothing's changed then. Situation normal. Okay, my next question is, who or what do you see as the main driver in permitting trans-identifying men to be housed in the female prison estate?
Oh gosh, well, that's a good question, isn't it? I mean, we know from some of the work that Professor Michael Biggs has done that there have been males in the female prison estate since at least the 1980s. Although the criteria that have permitted a male to be admitted to the female prison estate have changed over the years. So back in the 1980s, he had to have already had bottom surgery before he was allowed to go into the female prison estate. And then the criteria, as I say, they changed over the years, usually in response to a legal case, a judicial review that was brought by one of these males who wanted to be transferred to the female prison estate. So, you know, typically they'd win their case because reasons, and then the criteria would shift in response to that. As to why, I mean, we know from what's come out of Scotland that prisons were a deliberate choice early on because they were seen as an easy win. Because who cares about women in prison, right? Nobody cares. You know, they haven't got any, you know, political voice. They haven't got representation. They're few in number. They're traumatized. You can just neatly brush them aside. Who cares what happens to them, right? So if you can prove that you can get trans women into female prisons, if you can prove that you can do that, then you can use that as precedent and you can roll it out to other sectors. And I know that I can see that Tish is here and she's posted something about that in the chat that popped up. There's a quote from James Morton of Scottish Trans Alliance in Christine Burns' collection of essays published in 2018. And, you know, she's very explicit in what her aims as part of Scottish Trans Alliance were, that it was a deliberate policy choice to make it work in Scottish prisons, and then you can roll it out to other sectors. So I think women in prison have been used very, very cynically in pursuit of a wider agenda. You're on mute again, Alison.
I'm not used to this. How long has the policy been in place in England?
Sorry, can you start that again? Sorry?
You need to tickets.
Oh, I've lost you, Alison.
I beg your pardon.
What's on?
And on. Okay, let's try that now. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
That's great. And how long has the policy been in place in English prisons?
So, in terms of this particular iteration of the policy, that came in 2019. The previous policy came in I know Tish has got the dates at her fingertips. I think it was about 2016. And prior to that, I believe there was a 2011 version. But that may, there were more ad hoc kind of criteria which were applied in terms of the formal policies as they currently look today. I believe it's the 2016 one, which was then revised for 2019 after Karen White incident. And in Scotland, current policy dates from 2014.
Yeah, I read some research recently that I think somebody called Maycock has done, who took some research when he was working, for the SBS, and it was striking, the responses that they got from women prisoners who knew exactly what was going on, and that some of the people who transitioned in custody and reverted to their birth gender, I should say, following release. Is this a frequent?
Well, I mean, there's three things that I'd say about the Maycock research. The first point is that not all of it has been published, and not all of it has been released to us, even under Freedom of Information Access request. That there were a total of 4 papers published out of the research that he did. One was reporting on interviews with men in prison. We've never had that, and that's never been made available to us under FOIA request. One was reporting on interviews with transgender prisoners, and that was published pretty quickly, as you can imagine. There's another one which was reporting on interviews with women in prison, and that was published last year. And there's a fourth one, which is reporting on interviews with prison officers. And although that hasn't been published, it's been made available to us under Freedom of Information Access request. So the second thing I'd say is that Matthew Maycock, through the way that he writes, through his introduction, the titles he chooses to give his papers, to my mind, it seems quite clear that he is coming at his research definitely from the position of being a supporter of gender identity ideology, that he's not coming at it from a position of neutrality. That's just my opinion. He may feel differently, and that's fine, but having read his work and the use of the choice of words and concepts that he uses, particularly in his analysis, it does seem clear that there is a commitment to that ideology. However, the third thing I'd say is that, be that as it may, even Matthew Maycock, coming from what I believe to be that commitment to gender identity ideology, hasn't been able to, if you like, produce the results and the analysis that would actually bolster that position. So, for example, the paper reporting on interviews with women in prison, it's called, she was something like, she was just like a lassie and we never saw her as any different, you know, presuming to mean that the women in prison are completely accepting of trans women as women, because they just see them as women, they see them as female in every way. She was just like Lassie. But then when you read the text and you look at the results, there were only a minority were accepting of these prisoners being housed in the female estate, of these male prisoners being housed in the female estate. The majority were opposed, and some were opposed in really quite strong, for really quite strong reasons. So I think that this research, which is some of the first research that's actually looked at the experiences of women in prison or looked at the experiences of prison officers, is quite critical. I'd very much like to see the interview transcripts made available to an independent researcher for secondary analysis. And with within both quantitative and qualitative research, that can be quite usual practice, that, you know, you bank your interview transcripts. Yes, you can only get access to them, you know, with under proper academic supervision and with research ethics committee, etc., but it is quite usual that transcripts are made available to researchers for the purposes of secondary analysis. But what's quite stunning to me is I understand from a journalist at the Sunday Times that the Scottish Prison Service, despite having completely ignored the voices of women in prison and the perspectives of those organisations who represent the interests of women in prison, despite all of that, they've now decided again, even though they commissioned this research, that we're just going to ignore it. We're not going to pay any attention to it. I'd like to see that actually published in the media, so it's then more than me just saying it. It then becomes something that's quotable and could be. That
would be really interesting, wouldn't it?
I find that,
and to be able to see
exactly
what had been said.
Yeah.
Presumably, there's never been any debate in the House of Commons or any law passed about this. It's simply an administrative feature.
Well, that's the thing, is that once the legal framework, once the legislative framework is in place, and that will be things like the Gender Recognition Act, the Equality Act, and the Human Rights Act, once that is in place, the decisions that, and once a legal opinion has been received by the government and has been, you know, not received by the government, has been given by the government, then all decisions within that become administrative decisions. So yeah, that's where we are, and that's, I believe, why the policies are phrased in the way that they are, because they are consistent with the legal advice that the government has received on the legislative framework within which those policies have to be devised, managed, and implemented. You might be on mute again. I don't know where you are. Can anyone find Alison? I don't know where she is.
I was just going to say, Kate, given that Alison's not there, this is Tish. I just want to let you know I've blogged on all of that Maycock research.
Oh, did you?
I've done all, only because Claire Fox mentioned it in the House of Lords.
Yes.
And I do like to hunt my primary sources down. I completely agree with your interpretation. He was definitely borderline trans women are women.
I mean, not even borderline, really.
Yeah, I mean, it just is not. I mean, interestingly enough, the final paper that was published when he no longer worked for the Scottish Prison Service, but he worked in a university, he does at the end of that, I mean, it's annoying because he says, oh, it's inconceivable that women's voices would not be heard. He's freely admitted that the policy was introduced and the women were ignored. And bravo those women. Imagine they're in prison, they're opposing a policy, they know that they can be written up and reported and it can have implications for their sentences, and they still spoke up. Bravo those women.
Oh, absolutely. I think the bravery is immense. And, you know, they would have known that Maycock was part of the Scottish Prison Service. This isn't an independent researcher going in. So to still be able to speak up, and also, you know, the prison officers, you know, there were, have you seen a copy of the prison officers paper too?
No, I'd love to get hands on that.
Oh, it's on the website. It's on my website. I'll send it to you. Yeah, so, you know, they weren't happy strip searching male bodies. Women didn't want to do it. That some of them didn't know that they could actually refuse to do this, and there were. There were
was just gonna-
reports that there were male officers who en masse refused to strip search a trans man because they realised what it was that they were doing. They realised that this was a female body which they would be required to strip search.
Oh, that's interesting. I did notice that final paper where the trans identified males were asked about their view of HPM down view that has a wing, albeit in the female estate. And quite a few of them express, and if you just put the word men into it, quite a few of the men were complaining that they weren't getting searched as much and that they weren't allowed to shower with the women.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's incredible, really, isn't it? And what you were saying about the bravery of those women having been able to speak out, you know, I mean, this is, we heard in the House of Lords, and we keep hearing about, oh, well, there's no reported incidents of assault or sexual assault since 2019. Well, you know, I've got so many problems with that. Firstly, it is not at all clear that, despite what the MOJ is saying, it's not at all clear that those data have always included males with a gender recognition certificate. Because I've got a letter from the MOJ in response to a Freedom of Information Access request, which says that, yes, for the purposes of incident reporting, males with a GRC have been counted as female. And there's a statement in the judgment for FDJ which says that, oh, somebody's not muted, which says that the evidence collected to, I think it was mid-2020, it only about the rates of assault and sexual assault in the female estate. It was with respect to male prisoners with no GRC. So they were quite clear that it was no GRC. It wasn't everybody, and it wasn't including GRC. So that's one problem I've got with it. And then the second problem, which is, you know, the general problem, is reported. Well, you know, we know, I mean, I've had letters from women in prison, and I've spoken to female former offenders who have been in prison since 2019, and they've certainly got plenty to say about what's been going on in prison. And they also say, well, there's no point in saying anything. There's no point in reporting it, because firstly, you don't want to flag yourself up as being a transphobic bigot. And, you know, we heard about the whole thing about misgendering, how you can, you know, get a punishment, how you can lose your privileges, how you can be put in segregation if you misgender. And, you know, some of them also said, you know, they, to an extent, they feel for the prison officers, because the prison officers also feel constrained about what it is that they can do in respect of the behaviour of this group of prisoners who are perceived as being somehow special. You know, that this protected characteristic of gender reassignment is somehow elevated. And, you know, I'm not going to say it makes you untouchable, but that it is elevated, and that there are ways that you would normally approach things, but you can't approach that prisoner according to those ways because they are special. So I completely dispute that. And then it doesn't take account of, you know, the fear and anxiety. You know, even though the judicial review in FDJ, it was lost, the judges were quite clear that many women in prison may justifiably feel significant fear and anxiety at being housed with any male prison, not just those who are convicted of violent and sexual offences against women or who have intact male genitalia. You know, it was a clear statement that the impact on women's mental health is real, it's justifiable, it may be significant, and it may be common. So, you know, that has never been taken into account. You know, the risk assessment processes in the policies, which provide for, you know, this whole long list of factors that you have to take into consideration. So there's risks to the transgender prisoner if you're considering transferring to the female estate, and there's risks that that prisoner will pose to the other prisoners. So that's, you know, things such as, you know, their offending history, if they have evidence of sexualized behavior in respect of other prisoners, anatomy, that could violent tendency, you know, that kind of thing. But there's nothing within that about, well, let's look at the women in prison, let's look at the likely impact on their mental health, let's look at things like self-harm, let's look at what this is going to do to women in prison psychologically if you drop any male prisoner into the female estate, or in particular in respect of the male prisoner that you're considering. You know, if you've got someone who's a, you know, convicted rapist and you're going to drop them into the female estate, what will that in itself do to women in prison psychologically? And that's completely missing.
Liz Panton's got her hand up. Liz, can you unmute and perhaps you can ask your question?
I wanted to ask Kate about the early release scheme that obsolescence, can you mute yourself? Where they were giving prisoners, sex offenders, anti-androgens, and it was reported that some of them were then developing breasts and were identifying as women and were then unable to complete the sex offender rehabilitation because, and I know you've mentioned this already, because if as a female, then they weren't able, if they then got a GRC, they weren't able to be logged onto the system to be able to partake of the sex offender rehabilitation. And the last thing I read about this, which is a few years ago, was that they were planning to extend the scheme and build a special prison to accommodate 1,500 men at any one time who would be going through this process, so that even if they didn't get transferred into a female prison whilst they were in prison at that time, when they were then discharged, some of them were known to have then gone off the anti-androgens, but if they came back into the system, or they could then go on to get a GRC while they were out. But basically the prison service is creating male transsexuals who are sex offenders. All of them are sex offenders. That's the only reason they're part of that scheme. And I haven't heard anything more about it for a few years.
Right. I mean, you know more about this than I do, and I'm not going to be able to sort of shed any light or give any further information on that. You know, as you say, you know, I certainly haven't heard anything about this in recent years at all. One thing I will say, you know, you're quite right that if a male gets a gender recognition certificate, the sexual offender treatment programs aren't used for him. And that's for two reasons. One, because he's a woman. And secondly, because he's in the female estate, and sexual offender treatment programs are provided to the estate, not to the individual prisoner. The MOJ says that bespoke programs are offered to those prisoners. And I understand that the entirety of the programs that are available to prisoners are currently under review. So hopefully there's work to be done on that, because certainly, I mean, you know, we know that from the 2019 data, Nick Williams at Fair Play for Women, she did a Freedom of Information Access request asking for a breakdown by offence category. And although they declined to give that breakdown for the males held in the female estate on the grounds of small numbers, they did for the males held in the male estate. So at that time, there were 129 held in the male estate, and 57% of them had at least one conviction for a sexual offence. So the issue of providing SOTP to that cohort is important. And it's, you know, it's both important from the point of view that somebody shouldn't be able to identify out of it. But it's also important that where they can't identify out of it, that the programme is appropriate to enable them to take part within that. So I think that is really important. Another thing I'll just say about sexual offenders who've got a gender recognition certificate. So we know that males with a gender recognition certificate, they are risk assessed against the standards for females and using the risk assessment tools for females. So there's one risk assessment tool that's used for sexual offenders, and it's only validated for use with male sexual offenders, not females. So as soon as you get your GRC, that risk assessment tool can never be used on you again. So computer says no, literally, and it's taken off the system because the marker is changed from male to female. You know, and I know the Ministry of Justice will say, oh yeah, well that's fine because the risk assessment procedures that we do in respect of these prisoners, you know, they're so adequate that the fact that you can't have this risk assessment tool, it doesn't matter. But let's assume that's correct. I don't believe it's correct, but let's just for the sake of argument assume it's correct. But what you've done is that you've knocked that risk assessment tool off for that person forevermore whenever they engage in the criminal justice system going forwards. So if they're arrested again, you know, if they're convicted again, parole, probation, whatever it is going forwards, you have knocked that out. And that's just not good enough.
I think the other thing that's worrying is that the prison service is creating men who think they are women, who are already sex offenders, who they are then putting back into the community.
Yeah.
I know initially with this system, they forgot to tell the probation service. So the probation service wasn't monitoring whether those men were continuing to take their hormones even. But the bigger issue is, I mean, we already know that there is a link between transvestic fetishism and other paraphilias.
Yeah.
And the prison service and the MOJ are actively increasing the population in the community of men who are have a history of sex offending, who identify as women. They wouldn't be there in the community identifying as women if it were not for that prison service scheme.
But also, I mean, why wouldn't you? You know, if you've been banged up for 15, 20, 25 years, you know, and you've got a certain index offence conviction, so you're of a certain personality type already, and you're banged up for that amount of time, frankly, what else is there to do? You know, if you're an extreme sex offender, nobody in the men's estate is going to like you anyway. They're all going to have it in for you. So why wouldn't you want to turn that into victimhood, you know, and it's a perfect opportunity to get special status, to claim victimhood, to get special treatment, and with the eyes on a long-term prize of possibly getting transferred to the female estate. I also think boredom needs to be taken into consideration. I think for people in prison, you know, looking at vast stretches of time, boredom is a significant factor. So what else is there to do? Why wouldn't you?
I think, I'm sorry to come back just quickly. I think the aspect of this that is not being considered is the danger created in the community for when these men are sent out of prison. And the fact that the prison service is increasing through this scheme the number of sex offenders who will go under the radar and be more dangerous because they've been given drugs so that they present more as women. They've grown breasts, they take a new name, so that whatever the population was previously of men who identify as women who were sex offenders is being artificially increased to the danger of people in the community once they are discharged. So I think that scheme doesn't just affect the prison service while they're in prison, it affects everybody in the community.
That seems to me to be an aspect of it, of the prisons policy that hasn't really been ventilated. Liz, that's a really important point, and we ought to get that in all the papers. I think people would be aghast, and they'd rightly have questions to ask their MPs, wouldn't they? If they knew that that was going on, that actually the policy of the MOJ is to increase the number of sex offenders. That's
not the number of sex offenders, but the number of sex offenders who
in the
identify as
community.
women.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And I think there's a call there for an article in the press, don't you, Kate?
Well, I think part of the problem with all this is that it's very difficult to get information from the MOJ as to what is currently happening. And I think that's always going to be a challenge with getting something out there, is finding out what actually is going on now. So I think that's always a problem.
I think it would be another FOI request, because the document that described that scheme was on the Inside Time Files website,
right?
And it's been removed.
Has it?
If you, because I had it bookmarked and I didn't download it.
Yeah.
But the bookmark goes to an empty page, and you can go into the file section to see the structure of the file section, and it's just not there anymore.
It's not there. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm sorry to say I missed some of the previous discussion. I was bounced out as unwelcome. But I don't know if you've already talked about the judicial review, FDJ, versus the Secretary of State. Did you go through that? Because it was
we referenced it. Yeah, we referenced it. We didn't really go through sort of a step-by-step thing. We didn't discuss it in its own right.
I think we've got a link that's going to go into the chat. So we can try and put it up for you to have a look at. The actual judgment is online, and reading it yesterday and today again made me scratch my head in the inability of the counsel for the defence, the respondent, and the judges to realise how important this is, and they seem to be answering the question quite narrowly on simply an administrative matter rather than the impact upon actual people. Holroyd did say he was concerned about the impact, to be fair. Yeah.
I mean, I think that the strong points to come out of this was, the first thing is that this was the first time that a female prisoner had been heard in a court of law about this. We've had many judicial reviews and other cases that have been brought by males who want to gain access to the female estate, or who are complaining about various aspects of their treatment in the male estate, claiming discrimination. But this was the first time that a woman's voice had been heard. And win or lose, that was always going to be highly significant and a very, very important moment. And when you look back, and hopefully Tish can put up a quote, I think it was the 2009 judicial review, which was brought by a prisoner who was convicted of attempted rape and previously convicted of, I believe, manslaughter. I want to say manslaughter. And he wanted to be transferred to the female prison estate. And part of the evidence that was presented, it said that basically, to cut a long story short, if the sort of women in prison who are going to make an issue of him being there are the sort of women who just like conflict and like making trouble. So we went from that to last year, where her claim was met with sympathy. James Barrett, thanks Tish. Her claim was met with sympathy by the judges, who understood her difficulties, understood what she was feeling, and the statement that it is perfectly understandable that women in prison would experience perhaps great fear and anxiety when housed with a male prisoner. So I think that is very important. The judges were also quite clear that they've been asked to rule as to the lawfulness of the policies, not their desirability.
That was really noticeable.
Not their desirability. And I think that is also important. But yes, they ruled that it is lawful to house male prisoners, including those who are convicted of violent and sexual offences and who have intact male genitalia in the female prison estate. I would have liked to have seen that gone to Court of Appeal. I'm sure that there are very good legal reasons that I don't understand as to why it didn't. So that the fact that it didn't is not at all me making a criticism, because I'm sure the right legal decision was made not to take that to Court of Appeal. But I would be interested to see what a higher court was able to do to challenge the lawfulness of that. One thing that I think was clear to me is that the judges, in ruling the policies capable of being operated lawfully, they were assuming that risk assessment was adequate and fit for purpose. I don't believe it is. I think this was when you'd got kicked out, Alison, but I was discussing with Tish about how there's no risk assessment which takes specific consideration of the impact on women's mental health, of their fear and anxiety, and what either having a male prisoner in general or this specific prisoner dropped into their prison with them will do to them psychologically. And secondly, as you was just discussing with Liz, there's this very important risk assessment tool that cannot be used with males who've got a gender recognition certificate, and that they are assessed against the threshold, against the risk levels that are in place for females, not those that are in place of males. So I don't believe that they are adequate.
I think if I was a woman facing a prison sentence for anything at the moment, I'd be asking my brief to make these arguments in the hearing, in mitigation of sentence, if nothing else, that the risk is too great and that the risk assessments aren't being carried out properly. I actually, every time they're in court, get to say the same thing, because we've seen already transgender males, trans-identifying males, getting lighter sentences because they're transitioning, haven't we?
Yes, because it was too difficult for them to cope with being in prison. Yeah. Yes.
So what source of the goose must be source of the gander, isn't it?
I think that's a good point. Yeah.
So I hope that some of our lawyers are going to be listening, or maybe can write to our lawyer friends in sex matters and say this. I noticed some of the paragraphs were really quite striking. Joe Phoenix had something to say in response to Dr. Lammy. And then one of the respondents' lawyers, Hannett QC, said the single-sex exemptions should, so far as possible, be given effect in a way which is compatible with the Article 8 rights, and talked about them the not being compulsory to the defendants.
Well, yeah, I mean, this seems to be the legal framework that the government's operating under, which is that, and yes, it's quite correct that the single-sex exceptions in the Equality Act are statements of permission, not those of obligation, right? They allow you to do this, and if you do this, it's not discriminatory and it's legal. That's fine. However, it seems to me that by stating that they are statements of permission, they are kind of overly emphasizing the optional nature of those. It also seems to me that they are interpreting the Equality Act, coming at it very aggressively from the starting position that the Equality Act is intended to promote non-discrimination. It's intended to achieve non-discrimination, right? Which is correct, but the Equality Act within it contains the possibility of single-sex exceptions, which are non-discriminatory. So, I think it very much depends upon which lens you are choosing to look through things as to your path through it and where you end up. And yes, I know that the argument is often made that it's the Article 8 rights of these males to private and family life, which would be unacceptably breached were they not to be permitted, or at least have as an option, as an available possibility of being housed in the female estate. And I know in the House of Lords debate on Monday that Baroness Falconer, she asked Lord Wolfson, is it legal to house a male with a GRC in the male estate? So i.e. not in the female estate, in the male estate. And he was very careful to answer that by reference to a particular case. So yes, it is legal to house a male with a GRC in the male estate. But the question which he didn't answer was whether it's legal to house all males with a GRC in the male estate and to have that denied as an opportunity for them. I believe, because of the way it went Monday last week, I think that the government is operating from the position that that would not be legal, that it would not be legal to close off female spaces entirely to this group of males. And I think that's very worrying indeed, and not just for women in prison, that it's worrying for all of us.
One question that occurred to me while you were speaking is whether it wouldn't be possible for the trans-identifying males, with or without a GRC, to be placed in a women's prison on their own.
Well, that was kind of what the amendment was about, that it was if these male prisoners really cannot be held in the male estate after consideration of risk and case-by-case basis, etc., if they really can't be held with other men, then fine, you can put them in a separate facility. The amendment was very careful not to say where that separate facility was to be located, only that, fine, you'd be separate from men, but you also wouldn't have access to women.
Yeah.
I think it should be in the male estate, because, why should any more of the infrastructure of the female estate be given over to this problem? But you know what, if they said, fine, well, we'll just build this thing and it will all be, self-contained and nobody will have any access to any women, but it's part of the female estate, but look, it really is separate and in a way that Ewing in Downview is not, then, I'd probably take that as an acceptable solution.
Mm. Debbie's got a question. She asked, do you actually have the risk assessment tool that specifies those with the GRC aren't risk assessed in the same way as other male offenders? She'd like to quote it if possible.
Yeah, I've got that in the guidance document for that risk assessment tool. It states it in black and white. It was reissued in December, and I got all excited and thought, well, maybe they've made a change, but no, they haven't made a change. So yeah, maybe if we're in touch, Alison, and I can provide the link if you email me.
That would be great. And Debbie, if you want to contact us, then we can pass that on to you and possibly other people who need to be able to refer to it. Thanks so much. That's great. Catherine's got another question about the impact on women's mental health. She says, I hate to see the bar being set at whether or not someone is assaulted. What about all the other assistant things like the taunting, the threats, the institutional gaslighting?
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. I think that is a very, very low bar. and we know that the Ministry of Justice believe that their policies are quote unquote working well. Well, what does working well mean? How have you defined that? How have you assessed that? We know that these policies aren't evidence-based. We know that, in fact, they are going against decades and decades of solid evidence which demonstrates the international standards for prisons, that males and females should be held separately. So we know that they're not evidence-based. We also know that the MOJ, this is again through a FOIA, the MOJ hasn't either received an application or processed an application to conduct research looking at the needs of women in prison from this perspective, this particular issue, much less approved it. So it is not evidence-based. So, what does working well mean? Is it just data that you've collected yourselves on, official MOJ paper? What does that mean? But yeah, it's a very depressingly low bar. Oh, well, nobody's reported that they've been assaulted or sexually assaulted yet.
Yeah. Well, actually, they have, of course, with the Karen White case. There have been those assaults.
Yeah. I mean, that I'm always a little bit hesitant about Karen White, because that was the previous policy. And what we need to look at now is what's happening under the current policy. And I know that, it has been noted within the MOJ, when people start talking about Karen White or, having access to mother and baby units or being raped in prison, which of course we know happens in America. We know that those things have happened. That they're just, there's a little bit of eye rolling and, oh, well, they're campaigning against things that don't happen, or they're campaigning against things which we knew were a mistake. I don't think anybody in the MOJ is proud of Karen White at all. And they do recognise it as being an absolutely horrific mistake and disaster. That they're going, oh, well, they're campaigning about things that we know were wrong and we changed things. And, Karen White is safely ensconced in the male estate. And I would be exceptionally surprised if he did acquire a GRC, that he was ever transferred into the female estate. I don't believe that would happen. I would hope that they would have a hell of a lot more sense than to do that.
Catherine has got a really good question. If you know that complaining about a trans prisoner has you labelled as transphobic, and you could end up in front of a panel who could extend your sentence, are you going to report an assault?
Well, no, you wouldn't, would you?
Outside the prison don't report assaults.
Well, no, you wouldn't. You wouldn't report it, really, would you? I think it might have been said when you were out, you booted yourself out, Alison, but, we're in touch with women in prison and female former offenders under the current policy. And they say that, yes, stuff is happening. And no, we don't feel able to report it, partly because they don't want to be branded transphobes and attract that attention, that negative attention, with the consequences that's got from them going forwards. But they also said, they feel sorry for some of the officers who are constrained in what they can do because the prisoners have got special status.
Yes. What about searching?
Searching. So the searching protocols are under revision at the moment. They were supposed to be reissued last year. And before the amendment was debated last week, I had another quick squiz online, couldn't see anything new, so I'm chasing that up. But one of the options that was on the table was to permit male officers with a gender recognition certificate to strip search female offenders.
And it's the same in the police as well, I'm afraid.
Yeah, but yeah, and I know why they're saying that, because then it will make it symmetrical with what happens with male prisoners with a gender recognition certificate who can only be strip searched by female officers. Considerations of anatomy are irrelevant.
And the prison officers don't want to do that either, do they? Clearly.
Well, no, I mean, the research that came out from Matthew Maycock, they're not happy about it. They don't want to do that. They recognise all too well, as transphobic as that may be, that they are searching male bodies. Yeah.
I don't think it's transphobic, to state the truth. Certainly not.
No, I know. I was referencing what Matthew Maycock would, how he may have interpreted that rejection of their identity.
And the corollary of that is, what's the position of Keep Prisons Single Sex about male officers actually being stationed in women's prisons?
We don't take a position on that. There's more than enough to be done at the moment. I think that the analogies that you see bandied about over the internet about, oh, well, if you should be, getting male officers out of women's prisons, why are you focusing on the very, very few vulnerable trans women when, we all know what male officers get up to, etc., etc. Those arguments are never in bad faith, never in good faith. So I just step back from that issue completely. I do know from women who have been imprisoned, both when it was only female officers and then when male officers came in, as well as retired officers who again worked over that transition period, that they felt that there was a shift in the environment, in how women reacted, in the power, that there was a shift when men were allowed to work in women's prisons, and that it wasn't always positive.
Yeah, it's really difficult, isn't it? So the next question I've got for you is about how women in prison are being punished for not using the correct pronouns.
Right.
Has that been a real problem for women prisoners?
Well, I mean, a couple of the women who I spoke to, they said yes, that if you misgender, you can lose your enhanced status, you can lose your privileges, and you could be put in segregation. I think it was Lord Philip Hunt, who took that and asked a written question in the Lords about that, and we got the answer back from Lord Wolfson that it's only if a woman in prison made a quote unquote honest mistake that she could be assured that she wouldn't be subject to disciplinary action, and that yes, depending on the facts and the circumstances, and she that could constitute harassment. It could attract a hate crime aggravating uplift thing. Sorry, lost the power of speech there. You know what I mean? I'm sort of going like that to signify aggravator. Yes. And that she could go before a disciplinary board. Inside Time then picked up on that, and they ran with it, and they said that it could be up to and including having days added to your sentence. I'd be really surprised if that did happen. But I'm aware from my contacts that things like losing enhanced status and getting put in segregation are real fears for women in prison. And that if you misgender, or as we'd say accurately refer to the sex of the person, when you consider women in prison, so many of them have been the victims of sexual violence at the hands of men, rape, often since childhood, repeatedly. They know a man when they see one. They really do. And they know in the worst way.
Yes.
That fight or flight reaction kicks in. They know. So to gaslight any woman is appalling. To gaslight any child is appalling. But to gaslight a woman in prison with the typical history that so many of those women have had, to gaslight her and go, that's a woman, you will call her she, you will use her name. Okay, I don't want to use anybody's name that's on the thing. I'll use mine. You'll use the name Kate. That's what you will call her. Really?
Yeah. And bearing in mind that so many of the women prisoners have traumatic head injuries, usually following.
No, it's like 78%, one study found, wasn't it? Significant head injury, a rate of 78%, usually at the hands of a male partner, usually over many incidents over a protracted period of time. And for not all, but can't remember, I'm sort of dredging the depths of my memory now. Okay, don't quote me on this. I know this is going on Twitter, on YouTube, so I'm kind of quoting myself on this. I think it was 50-ish% of those who reported a significant head injury, they had some level of associated disability.
It was staggering, really. And
staggering. Yeah, and that's not to say that men in prison aren't vulnerable too. It's not to say that male prisons aren't very violent, unpleasant, brutal, and brutalizing places. Nobody's saying that men in prison cannot also be extremely vulnerable. Of course they can, but we're talking about women.
Indeed,
and we're allowed to talk about women in their own terms and in their own right.
That's somebody else's problem, really. But we have the solution, don't we? If the amendment last Monday had been passed to house vulnerable male prisoners or trans prisoners in a separate place, a third space, that would have solved the problems for all of them, wouldn't it?
Well, if it was about safety, then it would have. I think the fact that it fell shows that it's not about safety.
I think it wasn't so much that it fell, it was withdrawn, which means that they can bring it back when there's more.
Well, I mean, it was withdrawn because it was going to fall. And protocol dictates that when you know something is going to fall, you don't push it to a vote because it really, really irritates everybody.
That's right. I think it's probably worth us all contacting our MPs if we've got the slightest notion that they might be sympathetic.
Well, I've got a new letter going up on the website
great.
Tomorrow. I've updated the standard MPs like template letter after what happened in the House of Lords on Monday, so that I will post that on Twitter when it goes live. So yeah.
And we'll put it on Getter as well. That's another.
Thank you. I'm not on Getter. Should I be on Getter?
Well, we've got a space, and we do sometimes repost on that medium. That's great, and we look forward to hearing that. As well as being punished for not using the pronouns, what I want to know is, has anybody done any sort of analysis? Is it possible to do an analysis of the level of risk to women prisoners caused by this policy? I mean, how could they effectively estimate or project, even mathematically, the risk that is involved?
Well, I don't know how you could actually. The MOJ is, and I understand this. If you're a prisoner, you're still entitled to your privacy, and you're still entitled to not have your personal details, splashed all over the media. We don't know who these prisoners are with GRCs or without GRCs in the female estate. Anecdotally and from letters, we do know the identities of some of them. And I'll just say that in the House of Lords on Monday, we heard about these hypothetical cases that the policies have to protect. So, April Ashley, who transitioned when he was a young man and, who lived until old age and who, you know, died a couple of weeks ago, was given as an example, or, you know, the hypothetical examples of a man who transitioned in his early 20s and, you know, has spent 50 years on the hormones, full surgery, and then is convicted of, you know, a minor offence. You know, where should that person reasonably go? But I, you know, firstly, I find it extraordinary that, you know, these hypothetical cases are advanced as justification for these policies. Like, oh, well, this might happen, and you have to have a policy in place to take account of this situation, which might happen, but seemingly ignoring all the real life misery and the actual cases that are being enabled under this policy, which is there with your eye on, well, what about if this happens, this hypothetical case? So we know that these prisoners, they're not at all like, you know, these hypothetical cases. They are not, you know, and even if they were, these people, to my mind, they still shouldn't be in the female estate because they're not female. And the female estate is for females. You know, they're not long transitioned with decades of hormones and full reassignment surgery and, you know, convicted of benefit fraud or, you know, I don't know, hot wiring a car because they had to take their aged mother to hospital and didn't know what else to do. You know, not that. Yeah. And, you know, who would actually, you know, be a lovely influence on women in prison, and, you know, you'd all sit around painting each other's toenails. It's not like that. It's really not.
Marina has a question. She says it's not only the female prison estate staff that are working with transgender identifying males. Also, she says, women-only charities that support female offenders in prison and in the community have to offer support to the trans-identifying males as well. If they didn't, they would be labelled trans.
And they probably lose their funding.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's the ramifications are community-wide. As we heard before about the MOJ making sexual offenders more in the community because they're invisible because they're female, apparently. Then this is another way in which the ramifications of the MOJ policy is impacting people in the community too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Have you got any comment on that?
No, just, I mean, I that this is something I've heard, you know, that, you know, we've seen this with charities and women's aid groups all over. If they're not, quote unquote, trans inclusive, they're at risk of losing their funding. You know, or that they've constantly got a fear, and this is what came out with some of the evidence for the GRA consultation, that there's a fear that, well, you know, how much money have we got? We're operating on a shoestring. If we refuse to offer our services to this male or refuse to let them into our space, and they, you know, launch a legal action, you know, we haven't got the time or the resources to defend against that. You know, they're held to ransom. So, you know, I've got a huge amount of sympathy. I think, you know, people working in these sectors are really, you know, they're really up against it.
Lila's got a comment or something that's almost a question in a way. Women are being drugged. The bill for drugs in Holloway, when it was still operative, was 90% higher than in Parkhurst.
Well, we know that the rate of women with mental health problems who require psychiatric help in prison is much higher than it is in the male estate. I think it's about 50% of women need help with mental health problems in prison as opposed to 18% of men. So yeah, that those sorts of levels would not surprise me. I think that's shocking. You know, that shows how, you know, we're just failing women in prison.
Tish has got a question. Would you like to ask it, Tish?
Yes, I would. Can I just say before I ask this question, even for my own son, I do not think he should be in the female state. I know him very well. He's lovely. Doesn't matter. I'm his mum. He's a male, and he doesn't use female spaces. But my question was really going to be: he is really a gay male, but because of what's going on, he's now trans identified. He's on drugs that he got with no counselling after 6 weeks. But that's another issue. But my point is there not a rule to actually claim that they are discriminating against other vulnerable males? So if my son, looking exactly as he is, he looks like a male, he's a vulnerable young gay male, he would be vulnerable in the male estate, I have absolutely no doubt, on the basis of that protected characteristic, his sexual orientation. And yet he would get no protection for that, but he would because of the fact that he also is trans identified. Surely there's a route there to actually claim that gay men are being discriminated against, because there must be some stats about attacks on gay males.
I think that's really interesting, and that's, you know, one of the big things about this is that, you know, this group of male prisoners is by no means the only group of male prisoners who are vulnerable in the male estate, and I don't believe that they're the most vulnerable group in the male estate either. And by focusing so much attention on how to deal with this, really, you know, their impact on the female estate is big, but in terms of their total numbers, it's a small population. It's a growing population, but it's still a very small population. Focusing such a disproportionate amount of resources and time and energy on meeting their needs, you know, how is that not to the detriment of other vulnerable males in the male estate? And I think that would be a really interesting, you know, case. I mean, God knows how you'd ever find somebody, but I think that would be a really interesting case that, you know, this prisoner, because he didn't have the protected characteristic gender reassignment, was disadvantaged by being left in a more vulnerable situation, even within a vulnerable prisoners unit. You know, we know that that's not fail-safe, that he was left in a more vulnerable position compared to another male prisoner who did have the protected characteristic gender reassignment. I think that's, you know,
I was just thinking about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She took one of the first cases, but she took it on behalf of a male who was disadvantaged by being widowed and not getting the benefits women got. Yeah. And suddenly, because it was a man, the men who were the decision makers were identifying with the men. So they're disregarding the women, but they have some sense of solidarity with another man. Yeah. And I've seen that play out in work situations where women, they were should have been regraded, but as soon as a man was, all the men got rated, how can it be only on that salary? And he got a regrading because the men identified with him. Exactly,
because they care about it. Yeah, I think that's really interesting.
I mean, I'm not about to persuade my son to get banged up for a test case. No, really don't. Well, I was chatting to one of my female former offenders last year, and it was all about the misgendering thing. And we were joking. And I said, my God, can you imagine if I got banged up, how that would go down for me? Because I'd be misgendering left, right, and centre. And we would go, oh, that would be a really good test case, wouldn't it? You know, you could, you know, see how far you could push it. But no, perhaps not.
I know that Audrey Ludwig did a seminar, a workshop at the Women's Lib Conference last year, 2020, and that was really focusing on the indirect discrimination, or was it the direct, against males, that actually they could claim discrimination. And I think there's something that perhaps we should ask Sex Matters to have a go at, because I think that might be a useful a route to go down. So,
I mean, I think if you can find a case, yeah.
Lorna Richardson's got a question. Do you want to ask this question, Lorna, about risk to mental health? If you don't want to, I'll ask it.
Hello.
Hello, you.
Hello. It was just, it's a bit far back now when you were sort of talking about what is the risk.
Yes.
And it's a bit like the sort of Schrodinger's rapist question, in that whether the risk manifests itself or not doesn't really matter, because if every woman in the women's prison estate is braced for that risk all the time, then the risk is already there.
Exactly. The anticipation of that. It's like what we say, the process is the punishment. So it's like a variation of that, isn't it? It's the anticipation of the event.
Yes.
It's also the event.
Is part of the harm. They are already harmed by being, and hypervigilance, as we all know, is something experienced by women who've experienced abuse, which is, practically most of the women in there. And where is their opportunity to heal? Where is their opportunity to address a different life if they are hypervigilant all the time?
Well, exactly. I mean, I found on Monday last week in the Lords the complete disconnect between the previous amendment, which was all about the possibility of a women's justice board, and then Baroness Kennedy and others were speaking, really, quite rightly in impassioned tones about, since the Causton report, and we still are failing women, and this is where we are, and this is what we need to do, and the stats and vulnerability and trauma responsive and all of that good stuff. All of that highly appropriate stuff, and then a complete disconnect. No, but you should still be able to put males and female estate. That's fine.
Thank you. Yes.
I don't understand it.
Jane McTaggart's got a question, a really interesting question. Jane, are you able to ask this?
Yes, sure. I'm a Quaker, and we have a testimony to truth. So we don't take oaths, we affirm, for example. If I was in prison, I would find it extremely difficult not to misgender people. And I wondered whether you thought that my protected belief, and it is a protected belief, would enable me to escape punishment.
Can we not try it? I don't know.
I'd rather not be in prison.
Let's not try it. I don't know. I mean, it is interesting, isn't it? Then you get into the battle of the protected characteristics. Does your protected characteristic, how does that play out? I mean, I think what would also be interesting is, looking at the equal treatment bench book. And, we know that there has been a slight shift in, at least there is now a recognition that some witnesses might not be able to truthfully use preferred pronouns. But then there's a whole list of, you've got to consider this, you've got to consider that. Are the witnesses' reasons reasonable enough? I'm still not at all convinced that it will result in any meaningful change. But again, this would be quite interesting. If you pitched up court,
we may find out.
Giving evidence, and let's say that it wasn't a case of a sexual assault where you would also have that reason why you would want to refer to this person as male. Let's say it was just shoplifting, and you said, well, no, actually, I'm a Quaker and I've got the protected characteristic religious belief or philosophical belief. That would be quite interesting to see how that played out.
Well, this really feeds into the processes and the policies of the MOJ, because I think I read in the court case that they never conducted an equality impact assessment before they implemented the policy. And if they did,
I'd have to go back and check on. I know they did for Downview. I'd have to go back and check on that. I mean, if you read it, then I'm not going to doubt what you read, but I'd have to go. I'd need to go and have a look at that.
If they did do one for Downview, what was the outcome? What was their conclusion? Did they not think of things like pregnancy or rape? violent assaults, for instance, because males are normally strong.
Well, down view, they are supposed to be kept separate, except if they are highly escorted and supervised to within an inch of their lives. But no, it was felt that these males, that they did consider putting down view in the male estate, and they rejected it because that would be discriminating against this group of prisoners, this group of male prisoners. And they also, what was the other thing that was really important to mention?
Yeah, Liz Panton's got a really interesting quotation from Richard Garside. Do you want to share it with us, Liz?
Yeah, it's what Richard mentioned about is it the Josephine Butler unit at Downview?
Yeah.
That because it was assigned to house male prisoners, it could have been used to house young women who are currently housed with males in young offenders institutions for males, because they haven't got anywhere to house young women. So you've got adult males who consider themselves to be women being prioritised for the unit at Downview over young women who are being housed with men, because there's nowhere for them to go.
Yeah, I mean, this building, it wasn't just sitting there empty, gathering dust, waiting for somebody to do something with it. As you said, quoting Richard, it was going to be used for very young female offenders. It was going to be a bespoke unit for them. And then the MOJ said, no, we've got to put some men in there instead. So not only do the women at Downview now have to contend with these men who, you know, if you know the setup at Downview, yes, it's buildings, but, you know, there's not big high fences between them, and they are allowed to mix under supervision. So it's not completely housing them away and separately. So not only do they have to contend with these men, they also lost out. There was also part of the infrastructure, and that was removed from them.
But it's scandalous, isn't it, that they're saying, oh, because of we can't discriminate against them and they're so vulnerable. Exactly. What about these young women?
Oh, I've remembered what that thing was. I was going to say. So they decided that they couldn't house them entirely separately from the main estate at Downview because you've got to get your ears ready for this. It was important to foster good relations between the two groups of prisoners.
Let's
get this straight. If you've been housed in Downview, right, there are probably some serious incidents that have occurred, right? Oh, this is interesting. I've just thought of an objection to the MOJ statement that there haven't been any assaults or sexual assaults since 2019. Well, we know that there have been male prisoners in Downview during that period of time. So what is it that they did which made them end up in there? They must have done something wrong. So there must have been some incidents.
Right. So
that doesn't make sense, does it?
So search for information, really. Yeah, ICQ. The idea that the prison service is trying to foster good relations between the different protected characteristics, that's trying to cover themselves for their public sector equality duty.
Well, exactly. But it's laughable. So you've got one group of prisoners, very vulnerable. Many of them have been raped or sexually assaulted. And you've got another group of prisoners, male, quite possibly including sexual and violent offenders, quite possibly including those with intact male genitalia, and who have proved themselves to be of a level of risk that can't be managed safely in the general population. What good relations? Yeah. I mean, it makes it sound like it's, you know, the Women's Institute are deciding to get together with the Rotary Club in order, you know, to have a pub quiz.
Well, sadly, yeah, the Women's Institute does allow males.
Well, yeah.
We were talking before we started, Kate, about the United Nations Mandela rules, you know, the minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners. And it's quite precise, isn't it, about housing them in separate sexes, Rule 11.
Well, that's because it's evidence-based, and that's because you've got decades of evidence which clearly show that male prisoners and female prisoners should be kept separately. And the MOJ reinforces that throughout, except in relation to this particular group. You know, either you've got mixed sex prisons or you've got single sex prisons. You can't have this kind of wishy-washy, oh, well, we're pretending they're female prisons, we're pretending it's the female prisoner state, we're pretending it's the female offender strategy, we're pretending all of these things, but actually it's mixed sex.
Yeah, and Stiltish says same with the Geneva Convention.
Yeah.
Women are better off as prisoners of war than they are actually as citizens. There's another thing in Rule 52 in the United Nations. They talk about intrusive searches should be undertaken only if absolutely necessary and shall be conducted in private and by trained staff of the same sex as the prisoner. So, you know, here we are, United Kingdom not meeting up with the standard that the UN require of countries all around the world. It's quite abominable, isn't it?
It really is. It really is. It beggars belief.
Yeah. Do we have some more questions? I think we've. Oh, come on then, Lulu. You're going to ask a question.
Lulu. Hi, Kate.
Hi.
My question is, were you happy with the amendments? I mean, I know that they were withdrawn. Improvements to them. I mean, did those amendments work for you?
I think, I mean, knowing that nothing was going to get through, you know, it's kind of what is the other, you know, the other objective of getting them discussed is to get the discussion. I thought that the first one, which focused on GRC holders, was quite a clever one because we know that the policies operate unequally across GRC holders and non-GRC holders. And that's because of all the stuff about risk assessment.
When you say unequally, could you just explain that a little bit more?
So the MOJ says that even if you've got a GRC, it doesn't mean that you've got an automatic right to be in the female prisoner state, but there is a presumption of initial allocation to the female prisoner state. We know that although they say that the factors that have to be taken into consideration for risk assessment of GRC and non-GRC holders are the same, and for the sake of argument, I'm going to accept that, we still know that the process differs because a male with a GRC can only be removed to the male estate if the level of risk he presents would also see a female prisoner held in the male estate. So the comparator, the threshold of risk, is set up here for with a GRC, whereas down here without a GRC, you know, you can be removed to the male estate far more easily. We also know that, as I said earlier, the risk assessment tool for male sexual offenders can't be used with a male with a gender recognition certificate because he counts as female, he's recorded as female, and the computer says no and it simply deletes it off the system. And we know, we can see from the most recent data which have been discussed in the Lords, even though it's not publicly available, that although less than 1% of non-GRC holders are in the female estate, almost 100% of GRC holders are in the female estate. So we know the overall numbers are small, but in terms of the way that the policies operate, we can see that it's not equal across the two groups. So I think the First Amendment, by focusing on GRC holders and looking to put that amendment to the GRA, where there are comparable amendments, that there are comparable clauses about where GRC doesn't apply in this case, in this case, in this case, I think that was trying to drill down onto the fact that there is that inequality in terms of the operation of the policies. And in terms of the Second Amendment, I mean, yeah, fine third spaces if they really, 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 really can't be held in the male estate. Fine, crack on, but they can have a specialist transgender unit where their unique vulnerabilities and needs can be met, and you can make a decision about allocation to that unit on a case-by-case basis. That's fine. You can review it. You can take into account prisoner, preferences. You do at the moment, but they're not getting access to women.
Yeah, Judith's got a point which I think she thinks is widespread. Judith, Judith Wright, would you like to ask your point? Please. Is Judith Wright with us? Maybe not.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Well, it's just stating the obvious, really, I think, for most people here, and that is that, the problem we've got here really is that so many people have obviously been brainwashed now into thinking this is such a, men who identify as women, these kind of trans people, as opposed to young people who identify, obviously we know they're two completely different groups of people, but so many people think or won't deny, they won't say otherwise, that this group of men are more vulnerable than any other group, and they are more vulnerable even than women who are locked up, can't go anywhere, traumatized, may have been sexually abused, have had really traumatic lives. You can't convince these people sometimes that actually, often these people, the trans-identified males, are not actually that vulnerable. I mean, for a group of supposedly very, a minority, a very small minority of people, they have a hell of a lot of privilege and power. We know this. But I mean, one thing I've started doing really is not, when you come up across someone who tries to say, oh, what about the men kind of thing, I try and just kind of steer away from that. So many people on our side will start with, oh yes, well, we know they're vulnerable. But I think for me, it's important to just talk about how, in this case, women prisoners or women in general, how they are the vulnerable group here.
Absolutely, 100%. And I think, particularly where we look at some of these males who we know are housed in prison, including in the female estate, any vulnerabilities they've got are more than offset by the risk that they pose. But I think what was quite clever about the amendment on Monday last week was that it was just like, fine, okay, you've said they're vulnerable, fine, we'll accept that. You've said they have rates of vulnerability that approach that or are equal to those of women, that female offenders, fine, we'll accept that. Use the word trans woman, fine, we'll accept that. We'll do all of that. If this is about prisoner safety, then here's the solution. And it was rejected. So I think that's, I think, vulnerability, it's like it's a red herring from the two sides of it, really, isn't it? It's firstly, it's not an argument to kind of beat down women with, but it's also actually, as I think Monday showed, it's not essentially at its heart, it's not about vulnerability and it's not about safety. It's about the rights of this group. And I think that's what we saw.
Yeah.
But yeah, I agree with you about the whole vulnerability thing. It's, it becomes that these claims become a weapon.
Catherine's got a question. I think we're coming towards the end of our time, so I'm going to ask it for you, Catherine. We're constantly told that trans women are vulnerable and marginalised, yet also that we, on the GC side, the gender critical side, are a tiny minority and society is against us. So who is doing the marginalising?
Well, I mean, fine, tiny minority, but I think, everybody I speak to is on the side of women. And I think, if you look, certainly in recent years, if you look, there's been a huge shift in responses to the media. If you read the comments below the line on news articles, there's much more awareness of what it is that's actually going on. And that, this has just been gaslighting, and we're not going to be gaslit anymore. Yeah.
Wasn't the YouGov poll was quite positive from our point of view?
Yeah. Have you got that to quote?
Yeah, I think we put that in the chat earlier on. We might be able to do that again. What do Britons think should happen to transgender prisoners? And that was. Can you remember a particular feature of that one, Kate?
I can't remember the wording.
There's so many.
I was hoping you were gonna.
I have read it and I thought, oh yeah, that's really germane to the point. And that what they were saying was that people recognised that transgender people in prison shouldn't be in prison with women. And I thought, oh, that was absolutely solidly on our side. And that needs to be circulated as well, because that's something which is the politicians need to realise that the voters know what's going on and they don't like it. And I think
if this issue isn't going away.
No, and I think that if we're going to be having by-elections, we've had 2 in the last 6 months, haven't we? We should be saying this at every opportunity at the by-elections and asking the candidates what they're going to be pushing for if and when they're elected.
I agree. Yeah, absolutely. And just lastly, we haven't said anything about females who identify as transgender in the prison system. We're there in the female estate. Why is that? Because suddenly everybody understands biology and they understand what that means for risk. Remarkable.
It is remarkable. I happened to see a TV programme last week. I think it's a part of a series. And it was in the male estate, and blow me down, there was a trans-identifying woman seeming to pass in the male estate. And that would never happen. We know that.
No, we know that. I deliberately haven't been watching that because I just know my blood pressure will go through the roof. So
yes. It's one of these things where you want to throw something at the set, isn't it?
Yeah.
What about any more questions? Let's see. Somebody's mentioning, are there going to be gatherings outside prisons? Maybe. I understand that some things are in train, and if you're in contact with Belle Staffy, you might contact her and see what's planned. I don't think I better say anything else about that now. Judith, right again. Doreen, we need to be out leafleting the public, but of course many are on our side. I understand the reluctance to go out leafleting. And I think that is quite a difficulty, that not everybody is up for putting out leaflets. Have you got any more questions? I'm just going to try and open it up to, here we are. Somebody else has got a question. Female prisons house transgender identifying males and also trans identifying females, which is a growing trend. Is this a policy? Yeah.
Yeah, so females who identify as transgender, they're held in the female estate. Yeah.
Okay. And we want a link, please, Stiltish, to the article. Perhaps if you can put that on your Twitter or repost it on your Twitter, we can pick that up if you can't actually get it on here now. HP Laptop's got a question. Do you agree that we need to be careful about referring to trans prisoners in the female estate as female prisoners who identify as trans should remain there? Do you want to amplify that, HP Laptop? We need to be careful about referring to trans prisoners in female state as female prisoners. Hello? Say that again, please. HP laptop.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Hi. Yes, my concern is that the female prisoners who identify as transgender, my understanding is that actually they're quite settled and that there don't seem to be any issues with them being in the female estate. And so when there's a discussion about should transgender prisoners not be in the women's estate, it could potentially be detrimental to those female prisoners, because really the issue is male prisoners in the female estate. And so it's one of those switches whereby whereby women are used as a sort of a cloak for the men, and it may prove to be to the detriment of those female prisoners who identify as trans.
I mean, I think you're right that, you know, the weight of the discussion when we say transgender prisoners, you know, we are thinking about men who identify as transgender. The amendment last week, it was for where a trans prisoner cannot safely be held in the estate that matches their sex registered at birth. So that would mean that for that settled group of prisoners, female prisoners who identify as transgender, who are in the female estate, who are settled there, for whom there are no problems, they are safe there, they are secure there. There wouldn't be an issue of them being transferred out of the female estate. And currently they certainly aren't transferred into the male estate. So that amendment wouldn't in itself, it wouldn't be challenging that status quo.
I was thinking more of the survey that was quoted.
Oh, right.
Because obviously with that, it's asking the public to consider, should no prisoners who identify as transgender be in the female estate? And obviously the issue is sex, isn't it?
Yeah, it is sex. And I think, again, that's part of the problem. You know, if you start talking about, you know, transgender women is the phrasing of choice for the MOJ, it just confuses things.
Absolutely.
You know, they're not a special kind of woman. You know,
and am I correct in thinking that there have been no issues raised about the impact on female prisoners who do not identify as transgender, with having female prisoners in the estate who have taken testosterone, for example? I mean, I'm not aware of there being any problems that have been made public about that. I mean, of course, there may be individual issues, but they would be specific to the individual woman.
Yeah, I like you, I'm not aware of anything that's come out. But then given that nothing's coming out about the stuff that we know officially, about the stuff that we know is happening,
of course,
I wouldn't really want to say anything on that because I don't know. But I haven't heard anything as being problematic.
We've got a question from David Barnsdale. Do you want to ask your question, David?
Hi, I was just asking about the origin of women's prisons and what were the arguments then used to justify them?
What, originally when they were set up?
Right, yeah.
Oh, there's an historian who, I don't know if she's on this call, but she has done some work looking at the origin of the female prison estate, why that separation occurred. I'm not going to speak for that because that's not my area, but I know she has done some work on that, so I'm really sorry I can't answer that question.
Elizabeth Fry and the Quakers who were pushing for sex segregated prisons in the first place, and she used to be the only other woman on the £5 note.
Right. I think Tish might have just posted a link to something.
Oh, let's.
I don't know if that was a JSTOR.
Oh, fabulous! Yeah.
Oh, well done.
History of women's prisons.
There we go.
Fantastic. And
there we go. Thank you.
NorfolkWomenInHistory.com, 1751 to 1799 / Elizabeth.
Thank you, Tish.
Bravo, there we go.
Excellent. Have we got any more questions? Because it's now 9:15. Kate's been on the spot since 7 o'clock. Brilliantly.
Lovely.
And actually, I think you've all been really brilliant.
Can I plug my crowdfunder, please?
Oh, we're going to do that.
Allowed?
Yeah, we're going to put it on the chat now so people can link to
Thank
it.
you.
But I'd like to thank you all for the questions, and actually to all of you who carried on when I was bounced out of the machine. And I heard that you were carrying on really well without us, so that's great. Thanks to you all for joining in the conversation. And your website is kpssinfo.org, and also your Twitter is NoXY in XX prisons. And so if you don't yet follow Kate, then now's your chance to do it. I think the crowdfunder's gone on. Our next talk is going to be on Monday, the 14th of February. So if you're a refugee from St. Valentine's Day, then come and join us up, and we'll be hoping to talk to some detransitioners, but that's not yet confirmed. We'll definitely be talking about issues that are of concern to women. And look out for the announcement or sign up to our website, liberalvoiceforwomen.org, and we'll let you know, we'll send you the invitation as soon as it comes out. We also want to hear from you with any policy related issues or any problems that you want us to raise, and we'll certainly get on the case there. I also have to give thanks to Anna, our technical person and organiser of the Eventbrite Zoom meetings. Thanks to all of you for taking part in a great event, and most of all to our speaker, Dr Kate Coleman, for talking to us about a great injustice and a really thought-promoting evening. So you can help by going to the crowdfunder.co.uk/p/fighting-for-sex-based-rights of women in prisons -1 at the end. So don't forget to contribute to the crowdfunder, and do get in touch with us with lots of really good suggestions and questions. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks so much.